Our next speaker, Rabbi Dov Linzer, is the Rosh Yeshiva and Dean of Yeshiva Chovevei Torah, which, by the way, is a co-sponsor of today's event. So we are very excited to be able to work with them in New York. And much like Rav Bigman, Rabbi Linzer is really both a giant of halacha, of mastery of Jewish law, and also of engaging with people who need their support, and always thinking of ways to help the community and support the community as much as they can. And so we are also really grateful that he is here to join us today. We have source sheets for that, so we will just pass those out quickly. And maybe I'll just say, can you help with that? Thank you. That would be wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. And so we welcome up Rabbi Linzer. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. It's also a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Chovevei Torah. Wonderful to have the opportunity to be jointly sponsoring this together with Shalom, which is a synagogue that has just done so much in terms of the areas of inclusivity and sensitivity, both within its four walls and in terms of promoting it in a larger community. And it's really just so appropriate for Shalom to be sponsoring this Yom Iyun and for us to be doing it together with them. As you heard from Rabbi Bigman, he was addressing the issue of the immediate and the case by case. I'm going to be looking at the more attempts at a more systematic solution, an approach that would be able to address all situations. The trade-off is not only in terms of the question of immediacy and getting the court behind dealing with immediate cases as opposed to an approach at a systematic solution which would require one greater backing and greater consensus behind it, but also that systematic solutions will tend to work only on new cases, particularly to the degree that they'll involve issues like stipulations at the time of the Kiddushin, Hafka'at Kiddushin, various types of solutions really will have to be implemented on new marriages. And I think that these are the two prongs that we should be working on simultaneously, and they're not at all mutually exclusive. Dealing with people that are already married and when those cases confront us, and dealing with making sure that all future marriages will be set up in a way that we won't have to deal with these problems on a case-by-case basis in the future. I want to also say one word about why this is so important. It really does go without saying. Obviously, we're dealing with tragedies on a daily basis of women that are caught in dead marriages, women that are extorted. I think by now, the time has come in the community where we don't have to review those scenarios, although, of course, when you hear any one individual case, it really tears your heart out to hear about them. But I wanted to make 2 points that I think are not made enough. And one, I think, to some degree came up before. And that's the question of who is an aguna. You'll hear people that will try to minimize the problem. Oh, there's only really 10 agunas in the world, by defining it in such a narrow way. In a way, you could actually say, and this will be shocking, but it's my intention, that every single married woman is an aguna. And what do I mean by that? I mean, because I think recently they even did a study in Israel, how many women, when it comes to getting divorced, even if they get a get right away, I think a vast majority, Haredi, Datilumi, does not matter, will say that they basically just gave in to anything their husband asked for during the period of the divorce proceedings, even without threatening the withholding of a get, because they didn't want that to become a possibility. And that means that really any single woman that has been through a divorce is really an aguna, has been abused by the power imbalance in halacha, and and that has been taken advantage of, and has had her rights constrained, and has really been abused in one way or another. So really, every woman who's been through a divorce is an aguna, and any woman who might be through a divorce is a potential aguna. And I think that that's really quite a deeply, deeply disturbing issue, but there's a great deal of truth to that. And that gets to the other point about who else are we defending here, because we're not just defending, of course, we are primarily, and all of our focus should be on women that are being abused by this and have the potential of being abused. But you know what else we're defending is we're defending the Torah. I want to share with you just a brief passage from today's Daf Yomi. Today's Daf Yomi was talking about the issue of, it's the end of Maseches Yoma, after all the ritual of Yom Kippur and how that achieves atonement, and then we go into Tshuva, and how Tshuva achieves atonement. And the one thing which Tshuva does not atone for is the Gemara first says it's taking God's name in vain, an oath taken in vain. Then it says Chilul Hashem. Chilul Hashem is like the hardest thing to achieve atonement for. And what's Chilul Hashem? So the Gemara says here, I'll read now, I have everything on my little iPhone here. So I will tell you what the Gemara says here. Here's what the Gemara says. What's Chilul Hashem? It says, he says, Ezu Chilul Hashem. It says, anybody who acts in a way that his colleagues are embarrassed by his behavior or by even how people talk about him. And then it goes on and speaks about its way a certain person will ask. It says, it says like this. It says, somebody who studies Torah, does not act in an upright way and does not speak nicely with other people. What do people say about him? And now I lost my page. Hold on. That's the one problem with these things. Okay. Anyway, it says Oilo Lavo. That's I really need a Gemara. Here, 1 minute. It says, what do they say about him? Here we go. Oilo Rabo Shalimdo Torah, Ploni Shalime Torah, Ra'u Kama Mekukalim Masav, the Kama Mechurarim Darcho, Valava Kasavomer, etc. It says, woe to the person who taught him Torah, woe to the person who represents Torah. And the question we have to ask is not just about the Talmidei Chachamim who act in a way that cause a Chilul Hashem, but what are we doing to the Torah itself that we represent if this type of a Torah, this type of a halacha, is an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment in the larger community that we are representing a Torah and halacha that could allow for such a profound abuse, could allow for such cruelty being done within the name of halacha. And I think that, the pasuk says by the Torah, and it says, "Ra'u kol amei artz ki shem Hashem nikra lecha, rakam chacham v'gadol, rakam chacham v'navon hagoy hagadol hazeh, ki mi goy gadol hashadoch ukimu mishpatim tzadikim." What is this great nation that has such tremendous, wise, profound, just laws? And ask ourselves now, right? What does, and now the Aguna reality is known not just within the Torah observant circle; it's well known outside as well. What type of a Torah is this that we can be representing, that it's a Torah that quite the opposite of saying what a great Torah is, was a Torah that seems to be so unjust and create so much suffering. So I think that the call to finding a systematic solution is not just one for, obviously, primarily it is one about the actual individuals that are suffering so greatly, but in addition to that, we have to be motivated also just in the sense of defending the Torah and defending halacha, and finding a way in which that we can actualize its reality as it was meant to be, which is really a just and a moral system which brings greater justice and greater kindness to the world. So how do we go about this? How do we think about what a systematic solution can be? One of the things that many people might say is, why do we need to be looking for a systematic solution? We already have the prenup. I will admit that I, for a long time, was part of that camp as well. We have the prenuptial agreement, which when couples sign it, according to based in America, leads, I've been told, has always led to the getting of a get if a couple has signed a prenuptial agreement. And while there is still a major problem that the RCA, which has, was the one that initiated the prenuptial agreement, does not require it from its members. And I believe that recent studies, internal studies, have shown that less than half of its members use the actual prenuptial. Maybe it's less than half of the weddings done by its members. I don't remember, but still, that is a major problem, because here the rabbinic organization that was the initiator could insist that its members do it and does not. I will say, by the way, that Chovevei Torah and insists that requires all of its musmachim to use a prenup, and the IRF, International Rabbinic Fellowship, which I'm a member of, also requires that all of its members use a prenup. So the first thing we need to do is to ensure that we have the strength of leadership to mandate that tool that is at our disposal right now is one that is absolutely required in terms of its use. But if it is being used, what's the problem with it? Well, one of the problems is that it still requires first of all, a protracted process. Sometimes it could take a few years to get a get. Now, as long as you do get a get at the end, it's better than no get. But number one, it could take very often 2 years. It also is not unheard of that even in there, because of the nature of the process and because ultimately it's using leverage against the husband, that sometimes it's not that it completely avoids the problems of certain types of extortions or certain types of other things that the husband might want and try to demand from the wife before he goes along, because it can still be dragged on for a very long period of time. And it also is problematic because it just, on its basic level, is not systematic, is not a way in which basically it still enshrines or reinforces the power imbalance. And that, say that's the nature of the halacha, fine, but if we have to work with that, we will. But fundamentally, still, the husband is the one in control. It provides the court with a leverage and a pressure point in order to get the husband to give the get. But a type of a system that would fundamentally shift that power imbalance and create a greater power balance obviously would be something that would be much more desired. It is unfortunate that Rivka Hout is not here, because she is a decades-long Aguna activist, and she could tell you much better than I, having been in the trenches and worked with women in the process of getting a get, all of the reasons why the prenuptial agreement is still is less than perfect, and all the types of challenges and obstacles that are still in the way there. But I don't want to devalue the importance of that as our most immediate solution, and that is something that should be demanded by absolutely every single wedding. Every rabbi should require it, every chassan should demand it, and if every chassan is demanding, every college should absolutely demand it. And there really would be, there have been talks about trying to create policies about not attending weddings, not a rabbi not being a Masada Kiddushin, but lay people not attending weddings in which a prenup is not taking place, what we can do as a community to make it the absolute standard. But that's as an immediate solution. Let's talk about something that would be even more systematic. What I have for you in terms of the sheets is, I was not able, there's a lot of sources here in Hebrew, I was not able to translate them, but what I did do was I have a summary of all the sources on the front sheet. So hopefully, maybe we'll just read very briefly from one or two, but hopefully you can use this to as a nice summary of everything, and if you have a chance to look at some of those sources in more detail afterwards. So I want to talk first, number one, with the issue that is not a system, part of what I would offer as a systematic solution, but is something that I think is give us a little bit of an insight into some of the issues I just mentioned in terms of the community and the dynamics and the way these things play out. And that's going back to the discussion about, can a wife sue for divorce? Not can a wife be the one to deliver a get, as we all know, halacha says that the man is the one that delivers a get. But can the wife basically come to the court and say, I'm suing for divorce, and I want you, the court, to compel my husband to give me a get? So the husband will still be the one doing it, but because the wife is demanding it, the court will follow the husband and actually compel the giving of a get. You might be aware that some of the ketuvot that they found in the Cairo Geniza have in them explicitly the stipulation that the wife can, if the wife does at any point does not want to continue the marriage, she can sue and demand a get, and the court will force the husband to give a get. So according to the Gemara is not exactly clear about this. The Gemara talks about a woman who is a moredet, literally a rebel, and who refuses to have sex with her husband. And what is to be done in such a case? And the Gemara's point is not so clear. It basically says a husband can give a get, but he wouldn't have to pay her ksuva because she's bringing it upon herself. She's not the one having sex with her husband. The Gemara really addresses more the question about the consequence of paying the ksuva, does not address itself to the question about the court forcing the husband to give a get. And normally the cases that we are familiar with mostly about the court forcing the husband is one in which the husband, there's like a very clear case of intolerable circumstances that are being created in the home, even less than actual physical abuse, but completely objective, intolerable circumstances when the court would force it. But here the Gemara is pretty ambiguous about it. And many Rishonim say that if a woman just doesn't want to stay married, that's not enough of a reason. There's no objective thing that's making it intolerable for us to force a get. Nevertheless, the Gaonim and the Rambam rule that even if the woman just says, I don't want to stay married, that the court will force a get. And the Rambam has a famous line about this. If you take a look on page number 2, source number 1, I'll just read you the language of the Rambam. The Rambam says the following. He says, a woman who basically withholds sex from her husband, she's considered a rebellious wife. You ask, why are you doing this? She says, I find him disgusting, and I just can't go on living with him. I can't go on having sex with him. I hate him. I no longer love him. I don't find him, it's not tolerable. She doesn't have to give any other reason. Says the Rambam, you immediately compel him to divorce. Very powerful language of the Rambam. She is not like a woman taken captive, that she should be forced to have sex with a man that she no longer loves. Okay, she doesn't get her ksuva because she's sort of the one initiating it. Okay, so and he goes on to say the consequences of not getting the ksuva. But basically, according to the Rambam, the woman needs to say nothing more than, I can no longer live with him. And that then we would force to give a get because this is an intolerable situation. A number of the Rishonim strongly disagree, the Ashkenazi Rishon in particular, and they say, well, why should we allow that? He wants to stay married. She doesn't want, just because maybe she found another guy that she's more interested in, just because she doesn't love him anymore, that's what she says. Why is that a good enough reason to force him to divorce? What about Sholom bias, sort of like from his perspective, he wants to stay married. And the reason is that this is a lot, I think, about what we hear nowadays, right? The woman basically, wants a divorce, and some type of post-game under the guise of, or under the idea that Sholom bias means always keeping a marriage together, particularly regardless of how the woman is feeling, that's not a good enough reason. Shalom bias, we should try to keep the marriage even if she wants out. I just have to say, the best line about Shalom bias in a slightly different context, Rabbi Riskin once said, he said, you know what the husband's idea of Shalom bias is? Husband's idea of Shalom bias is, oops, look at the time, gotta go to shul. Shalom bias. Go to the daf Shalom bias. So very often it's Shalom bayit from the husband's perspective and not exactly from the wife's perspective. Now, nevertheless, this would be amazing if basically a woman could always sue for divorce, assuming at least you were in a situation in Israel or whatever where the courts were willing to use, some sense of force, physical force, other force. A woman could always just sue for divorce. But as you've heard, some Rishonim say, no, that's not a good enough reason. That's not justified. Just because she wants out is not a good enough reason. What is behind possibly this more, if you would, progressive or, approach of Rambam and the Gaonim? So if you take a look at source number 3 for a minute. It gives a little bit of an insight. And source number 3 says the following. It says, Miha, this is from one of the Gaonim. Rabbanan Savorai the Basar Hora'ah Tiknu L'Maaseh. The Savoraic rabbis, right after the sealing of the Gemara, very early in the period after the sealing of the Gemara, established the Mishkal Afilamai the Tfisa Umaisa Lagita La'alter. So that's part of that is about Ksuba, but basically you give her a get immediately if she demands it. Kadei Shabotate Senah B'Not Yisrael with Tarbut Ra'ah, so that the Jewish woman should not go to evil practices, on a bad path. The Kach Amad Davar, and that is the common practice, which means that if a woman wasn't getting a get, she basically would just walk away from the marriage. Or what we actually know is that they would convert to Islam, and therefore as Muslims, they would be freed from their Jewish marriage. And therefore, it was the pressure of, how drastic the alternative would be, which pushed the Gaonim to make a systematic takana to ensure that alternative would not happen. And that really, I think, is an important thing in terms of thinking about sort of the role of the community. We will see, for example, that one person, some even, some Rabbanim of the previous generation, you hear it nowadays as well, suggest things like we just shouldn't do Kiddushin. Just, live together, secular marriage, don't do Kiddushin. And I think the more that people are prepared to, I'm not suggesting, suggesting that, I'm certainly not suggesting walking away from the marriage and converting to Islam, but the more that the poskim are seeing that people won't tolerate the situation, and they're willing to actually really do some radical alternatives, the greater pressure it creates on trying to find not just a case-by-case solution, but a systematic solution. And it seems that pressure was more in Islamic lands, where I imagine that it was easier, in general, it was a more open society. It was easier to leave the Jewish community, whether to convert or just to basically just act without the constraints of the society. And therefore, the Gaonim and Rambam had this approach that basically you would compel a get when the woman would demand it. That does not become the accepted halacha, and you need even for a more objective reason, and more really intolerable situation as sort of assessed objectively, as it were, in order to compel a get. Now again, not like nowadays compelling a get is a systematic solution, certainly not outside of Israel and even in Israel, knowing sort of the deep problems within the bureaucracy and within the Israeli courts. But I share it because it was an early systematic solution, which actually came because of a sense of how radical the alternative would be if we don't come up with a solution. I mean, it looks like you're eager to say something. No? Okay.
No.
Yes.
For years I thought that because the rebel wasn't acceptable, it wasn't acceptable what we call a matla mevueret. She has some reason, it's a sort of in between, the Achronim sort of go in between kind of statement, which is a matla mevueret. If the Israeli courts, the rabbinical courts, would work on that, we could solve within Israel most of the problems. Right. For years and years I thought that was the way we would go. I just gave up on it.
Right. Well, that's the problem. The problem is in Israel now the courts are such that even when their cases are clearly calling that nobody would debate should call for a compelled get, the courts absolutely refuse to compel a get. They're always concerned, first of all, they generally don't want to do these things, and number two is they're concerned, maybe somebody will say it wasn't justified, and then it's a get kafui, and it's invalid. So I'm not at all suggesting that within the Israel, in America you can't do it because we don't have power. In Israel you don't do it because the nature of the courts and the bureaucracy and all of that is that they're completely, not prepared to use it even when it's clearly called for. I only put it out there not as a model of an early systematic solution that was done because there was a clear sense about if we don't do it, it's going to be even worse, and how that pushed to finding a solution. So let's talk about what other types of solutions were suggested. And this already goes back to 19th century when, more and more, when people are living as, in an open society and citizens of the state, and is not just within an Orthodox community, not necessarily even within just a Jewish community. They have identities as secular, as citizens. It's quite becomes more and more commonplace that husband leaves their wives, don't give them a get. That the local power of the local communities and of the court system is no longer in place to compel a get. And what are you going to do? And solutions start being suggested already in the 19th century, a lot of different approaches, and we're really going to quickly review that. And basically, they boil down to three. If you just look here at the cover page, you have conditional marriage, Havka'at Kiddushin, which is annulment, and number three is assigning a get. Okay, basically, at the time of the marriage, assign a get to be given when circumstances are met. So let's just talk first about conditional marriage. So conditional marriage is very simple. At the moment of the Kiddushin, they're under the chuppah. The groom says, "I'm giving you this ring on the condition that if we get, let's say, divorced in secular law, and by that time I haven't given you a get, you could change the specifics, but this is broad strokes. Then if by that time I haven't given you a get, by the time we get divorced in civil law, by the time we're separated, whatever the case is, then this marriage will be considered to never have taken effect. I'm only marrying them with the condition that I will give you a get if by the time by the time we get a divorce." Okay, so would that work? Make a condition, make a stipulation. The stipulation, when the conditions are met, then it undermines retroactively the actual effect of the marriage. So what's the problem with that? So the first problem is that the Gemara deals with, while there's a lot of cases in the Gemara about Kiddushin al T'nai, Kiddushin is the act of the giving of the ring. That's when they're legally married before they've begun to live together. The next stage is called Nisuin. Nisuin is actually what we have sort of them being under the chuppah, saying the Sheva Brachos, or going to the Yichud room. Nisuin is the period of they actually begin living together as husband and wife. And the Gemara deals with the case about Kidsha B'Tanai, the Kinsa Stam. The Kiddushin was done on a stipulation, but then when they actually began living together, there was no repeating of the condition. They just started living together. And the assumption is that it's a good chance that we have to be concerned that the woman waived the condition, because once they actually started living together and having sex, then she wouldn't want it that 10 years later the condition would be satisfied retroactively, they never would have been married, and therefore they would have been living in sin all those years. It would be biatzunut, it would be like they'd be, sex outside of marriage. So without repeating the condition, then it would actually be like she had waived the condition, and therefore the condition would no longer be effective. So that should be problem number one. Now, problem number two that the poskim raise is, if anybody's learned these sections in Kiddushin, there are these major sugyot called T'nai b'nei Gad u'bnei Reuven, that you have all mishpatei ha'tanoim, you have all these details about how you have to stipulate a condition to make it binding. So the two questions that get raised is, do people really know how to do all those things correctly? Which is like, okay, fine, so hire a lawyer or get somebody who does know, it's just to write it all out. But any rabbi, so many rabbi people are Mesadrei Kiddushin, they don't know how to do all the details, and you have the problem that she maybe waives it when they actually start living together. So the rabbis of France tried to come up with this as a systematic solution, Kiddushay T'nai. This was shot down by, this was 19th century, by many other rabbis. Rabbi Dov Linzer at the head of them. There was a book that came out which is called Ein Kiddushin al T'nai. And some of these reasons were the technical ones. If you take a look at here again, we're only reading a very few small selections of the sources. Take a look here at source number 8. Okay. And we have the following. This is from Rav Dov Hoffman, Melamed Lahoyo. He says, I'll skip to the second paragraph. He says, there are so many details that you have to attend to. If you really wanted to do that, you need a big rabbi to oversee all the details. Nowadays, he says, any young rabbi can go ahead and be a Masada Kiddushin. So no, they don't know all these details. They're not going to do all of the requirements. Okay? So problem 101 is, yes, are there technical ways you can address the concerns? Yeah, but I don't trust you to be able to do it properly. Okay? And then he goes on and he says, and here it's very it's an insight into a policy consideration. We opened with policy considerations. It's important to note that there are opposite policy considerations. And here's what he says the following. He says, Yeter Mikain, it's about, the 5th paragraph. Okay, he says like this. Yeter Mikain, if you have a kiddushin and t'nai and a condition, then the sanctity of marriage would completely be undermined. Nobody would feel I'm bound by my marriage, because what I'll do is eventually we'll go ahead and if I get a get, or don't get a get, right? We get divorced without a get, retroactively, we've never been married. So I won't feel that I'm bound right now by the halachic demands of what it means to be married, because retroactively I could always make it that I was never married. Okay, and he says, therefore, we can't allow such a thing. It would undermine the sanctity of marriage. And then the third paragraph, then going down one more paragraph after that, and I have another point I want to make. He says, there are now these reform rabbis, they're playing around with halacha. They say you don't have to do chalitza. Okay, and it goes on, and now skipping a sentence. And with David Tzvi Hoffman, there becomes this big issue called chikui habinim, mimicking the heretics, which means doing anything that is something similar is being done by reform rabbis, or we would say conservative. That would be the concern that you hear nowadays among various issues. If it looks like something being done in another denomination, then it's going to make it look like we're just like them. Okay, even if we can do it in a permissible way. What will these reform rabbis say? In Elu ha-orthodoxim, you see, they agree to us. They agree you have to reform the system. They agree that the Torah and halacha is not just, and therefore we're right, and therefore we should be complete systematic reform. So here becomes two very interesting policy concerns in addition to the question of the specifics, right? A policy concern that is going to undermine the sanctity of marriage. And number two is, which would be the response. I start by saying if we don't do something, then we are seen as professing and upholding a system that is profoundly unjust. And he says if you do something, you're admitting that it's an unjust system, and therefore that's going to be the worst thing ever, and you're making it sound like you can do whatever you want. So personally, I think I've made it clear where my sympathies lie. I think it's much worse. I think it's sort of the injustice is known, and it's much worse to pretend that it's not a problem, and our real responsibility is to address it. And just because, again, other denominations have come up with recognized problems, and their solutions might not have been ones that work with halacha. God forbid that should seal from us the opportunity, the mandate to address these things within a halachic way. The question about uprooting the kedusha of marriage, that everything is stipulated, I'm going to push off till the end when we talk about combining them and how we think about that. I will, though, say, Rabbi knows, but we were trying a few months ago until we were all hit with the snowstorm in Israel, which I think was a whole 6 inches, but for Israel it was like the 2 inches in Chicago, completely devastated the entire, immobilized the entire country. We weren't able to have it. We were planning on having a conference of rabbis there to discuss these issues, and one very major proponent of solutions for the Aguna issue did not want to talk about any solution that retroactively would undermine marriage for this reason. I guess I want to talk about solutions, but nothing that would basically say that the entire Kiddushin is not necessarily going to be effective if under certain conditions. So this was one approach, stipulated. Is it possible to address the issues? Yes, it's possible to say that you repeat the condition at the time of Nisuin. It's possible to attend to the details. There are concerns whether you actually will attend to those specifics and details, but there also are policy concerns about retroactively undermining the marriage. I do want to take a I'm trying to be conscious of time. Okay, so I want to take a quick look at one or two of the responses. This is a wonderful book called Siddur Kiddushin V'Nisuin by Fryman, which is in Hebrew. I don't think, unfortunately, it's been translated into English. And this is not specifically on the issue of finding solutions to the Aguna problem. It really is covers from the time, I think, of the Gemara itself, certainly post-Gemara, I'm pretty sure it starts in the time of the Gemara itself, all of the minhagim and takanot that were established relating to Kiddushin and Nisuin goes historically, from the Gemara time to modern day, through all different types of communities, Ashkenaz, Sfarad, all different types, all in all different lands. And when you get to the modern day, he deals with all the various solutions that were put forth, the systematic solutions that were put forth to deal with the Aguna issue. So it really needs to be translated because it is like a key source book on all of these solutions. So within this book, he talks about different types of solutions. One was to do this Kiddushin al T'nai, plus, as we're going to speak about, the Hafka'at Kiddushin, the sort of annulment of marriage. And so it's already important to note that early on they were talking about combining solutions. The more you can combine, you can address different concerns, because we got a lot of options going on here. Okay? And then, but if you want to look here at the second paragraph, number Zion, I've underlined it. He said, HaKiddush b'hatza'ah zo, the chiddush in this approach, one of these solutions, which was about a kiddushin on T'nai, not just combining two solutions, kiddushin al T'nai v'takanat hafka'ah, conditional kiddushin and annulment, says you don't have to restate. Imagine what you're doing. You're telling them under the chuppah, on the following condition. Like imagine saying that under the chuppah. So there's ways now that it's, you sort of write it out beforehand. You don't have to necessarily say it at that moment. But how about you have to restate it at the time of yichud? Because the whole problem about implicitly waiving it once you move on to the nisuin. So this, he says, this one of the solutions said you don't have to repeat it. Why? Amram ki t'nai zeh shu l'tovat ha'isha ino yachol lavo lidei piyusa v'gam yahbiu et hachatan b'kala that shelo yivadu atmayim b'olam. If it's done for the woman's protection, she has to be the one to waive the condition. And basically, already about 2 centuries ago, some poskim were saying, we cannot, this thing, which is obviously coming to really, in a very profound way, protect her interest and protect her from being an aguna, the possibility that, maybe the condition will be met and retroactively we'll have been living in sin and having sex outside of marriage, that's not a concern anymore. There's no question that she is not going to waive this condition, which is all there to protect her interests. So already sort of recognizing that the current realities are different, and maybe we don't even have to worry about the possibility that she might be considered to have waived the condition. Similarly, he says, there's other things about making him take an oath to promise that he's not going to waive the condition. And I want to skip to Yud Bet here and says the following. And this Rabbi Bigman really echoes what Rabbi Bigman is saying. And here's what he says the following. He says, here was the condition, underlining here in Yud Bet. If there's ever a situation of igun, you are kiddushin b'telim, lo tiyeh tzricha get, afilim chay imak derech kol ha'aretz, even if they've been living together. Devadai zot umdina demuchach. Does that sound familiar from the previous lecture? The adaiti dahachi lo kitcha atzma. She never would have wanted to marry herself if it would have ended in a effective dead marriage divorce without a get. Ve'afilu below hatna'a befeirush b'shat hakiddushin. Even with no stipulation. She doesn't have to say anything. So Rabbi Bigman was saying, well, if he's abusive, and right afterwards, this Rav is saying that forget abusive. If he's just divorced, if they're separated, divorced, effectively divorced, with no get, she never would have wanted to be married under those situations. She doesn't even have to say the t'nai. It's like there's always an implicit t'nai there. Okay, that's pretty amazing. Every single case. What I want to point out that people might be aware of, that both this and what Rabbi Bigman's approach are, they also relate to a similar approach which has fallen into disrepute. And I'm not saying there aren't halachic problems with it, but we should point out is the approach of Rabbi Rachman. that basically wanted to say that no woman would, every marriage that winds up with an oguna is effectively a nekach ta'ut. Okay, and this is no woman would ever have wanted to be in that circumstance. And this is basically saying it and the framing it as a condition. She would have always wanted that to have been an implicit stipulation, and she never would have wanted that consequence. The final point in your Gimel says, and this is also fascinating, talking about acknowledging modern realities, that it's no longer considered like, oh, they've been living in sin. Oh, I would have waived the condition because I wouldn't want to be living in sin. You're not living in sin. As long as you're civilly married, says Sposek in Yossi Gemara, he says, then that's not a reality of living in sin. It's not necessarily halachic kiddushin, but it's not just stam sleeping around, and therefore we don't have to be afraid that that's going to make you waive the condition. You've been married, all right, halachically, retroactively, who knows? But it's not going to make you want to waive the condition. So there's a lot of solutions that have been put out there to say, she's not going to waive the condition. Maybe she doesn't even have to make the condition, which is really radical. Everything is umdin under muchach. There are ways to take care of it, but there's opposition. A lot of the opposition is about policy, less than about the actual specifics. That is the issue about conditional marriage. The next issue becomes, and I really think that I have to start summing up. So, okay, I only got one of the three possibilities. So no more sources, all right? But I'll summarize the other two. Hafka'at Kiddushin is one that you might have heard about. Rabbi Riskin recently has really made a push, particularly in the Israeli Knesset, to try to get an idea of Hafka'at Kiddushin established. That's the idea that the rabbis could annul a marriage. Now, someone understands that the whole mechanics of Hafka'at Kiddushin is a type of a conditional marriage. Everybody makes their marriage conditional on what the rabbis will say. But there's other ways of understanding it as well. The rabbis are empowered to make the ring that was used for Kiddushin ownerless. They're empowered to acknowledge and not acknowledge marriage. It's not necessarily because it's conditional. It is worth noting two things. That there was a big question, can you do annulment of marriages after the time of the Gemara? A number of Ye'onimin communities, again, particularly in Sfarad, did takanot that were backed with Hafka'at Kiddushin. For example, there was a takana that you had to have the Kiddushin in front of a minyan. Why? Because if there would not be 10 people around, first of all, you might get married for some crazy reason like love and not because your parents had arranged it. So they wanted to prevent people from doing that. And number two is that people would sometimes say, oh yeah, I married this woman in front of these witnesses, and now if you want me to give a get, you're going to have to give me $1 million. So in order to prevent those types of things, I said no marriage should take place if not without 10 people present, including the parents of the chassan and the kal and so on. Okay, so somebody comes and says, fine, we violated that takana. We got married anyway. So then they said, no, if you violate this takana, the marriage won't take effect because the rabbis annul the marriage if it violates this takana. And many of the Rishonim felt that could work. Some had reservations, can we annul marriages after the Gemara? But many felt that they could. Now, the point is that is not directly relevant to our case. Because that is, without getting into the nuances in the Gemara, there are two types of annulling of marriages. One is a refusal to recognize the marriage from the outset. The other is, for 20 years they've been happily married and we have recognized it. Now, retroactively, we're going to say it's like they were never married. So what we do find is the Geonim and Rishonim being prepared to say, if you do a marriage which violates our rules, we won't recognize it from the outset. What is much rarer is saying that it was all okay, but because of X, Y, and Z later, retroactively we're going to annul it. Although that is much rarer, you do find it every now and then. There's a famous story of the Ramah with women from Austria, Neshe Österreich, that were taken by non-Jews, and there was a question whether they were raped, and the rabbis allowed them to go back to their husbands, the Kohanim, and saying that that the way to solve this would be, well, even if that happened and so on, we'll just do Hafkas Kiddushin, so it's like they were never married. And now they get married again, and we could solve the whole problem. So there was a case where it was Hafka'at Kiddushin of a marriage that had already been good, and it was after the fact. Nevertheless, that was not to allow her to marry another man, it was to allow her to stay married to her husband, So, it's not so much that we have cases of Hafka'at Kiddushin, of a court actually annulling marriages that had existed to allow a woman to marry somebody else. But you do have it discussed. Even Rav Yaakov Yechiel Weinberg, the Sridei Eish, talks about the possibility of using it time to time. Although I do not believe, and Rabbi Bigman will correct me, that Rav Avad Yosef ever sort of writes about it directly in a tshuva. I do have it on very good report that Rav Avad Yosef would, from time to time, use this as well, as an after-the-fact, case-by-case, the possibility of Hafka'at Kiddushin. Do you know about this?
Only by rumor.
Only by rumor, right, only by rumor. So nothing that actually is getting written down. So that's another possibility about Hafka'at Kiddushin. One thing that's worth mentioning about Hafka'at Kiddushin is that when it is done after the fact and retroactive, according to a number of Rishonim, and here becomes the power of combining the different approaches, according to a number of Rishonim, because of this concern that it undermines the institution of marriage, like, what is this? We were married and now retroactively you say we're not? That in order for us to be able to do it, you need there to be some semblance of a get. And then basically, I call this like the fig leaf approach. As long as there's some semblance of a get, okay, it's not a blatant use, a bald use of power. Like, oh, it was good, and now we're saying rabbis are gonna uproot it. Because the get, even if it's technically not a kosher get for whatever reason, but the presence of a get allows this to work behind the scenes and makes it look that it doesn't challenge so much the institution of marriage. And now you're beginning to see the benefit of bringing these ideas together, because not only does it, if you don't like A, you can do B, and if you don't like B, you can do C, but in some ways they reinforce one another. And this gets to the third idea, which is the idea of pre-assigning a get. So this Rav that I mentioned before, who did not like Hafka'at Kiddushin, did not like Kiddushin al Tanai, he said we got to totally focus on assigning the get. And assigning the get is basically before the marriage, or, you basically, the chassan goes to and says, I hereby, appoint whoever reads the following writing that he'll be my shaliach, my agent, to write a get to my wife on the condition that, we get divorced in civil court or whatever, and I don't actually, and after X amount of time, or, or by that time, I have not given her a get. The similar types of problems with pre-assigning a get are that he could always annul the pre-assignment any time prior to its actual delivery. And again, are there ways of dealing with it? Have him take an oath that he won't do it. What if he violates the oath? So actually have him basically say, I am from this moment on nullifying any nullification that I will do. I'm pre-negating any negating that I will do, or if there's ever anybody ever hears me negate it, I trust, my wife should be believed to testify more than any statement I make that I haven't negated it. So you basically make it so that any act of negation is not recognized within court. So you have all of these approaches. There are technical reasons, but a lot of those technical reasons are ways of being addressed. And a lot of the opposition has more to do with the policy question of what does it mean to have a way in which, and this was another passage from David Tzvi Hoffman I didn't read, that effectively, because you're getting divorced in secular court, that makes you divorce Jewishly. So it undermines the Kedusha of marriage, and it basically puts the power in the secular courts. By combining the three, you actually solve a lot of those policy issues as well. Because if you actually have a get, the get becomes the fig leaf, as I was saying, for the Hafka'at Kiddushin. So if you don't think the get works, well, you have the Hafka'at Kiddushin, but the get makes it so that it's not obviously undermining the Kiddushin. If you think a marriage on a condition is problematic because it undermines the sanctity of marriage, well, but you have the get. So, we can focus on the get, and we don't have to focus on the conditional marriage. They allow you to sort of say, look, we're going to focus on the get so it doesn't threaten the institution of marriage. And anybody who thinks that the get isn't working, we have other things that are taking care of it as well. But the presence of the get actually is a way that addresses some of these policy issues as well. And for me, clearly, the overriding policy concern is the much more profound way in which, so many people are suffering, are abused, and are being abused in the name of halacha, and halacha is becoming the tool through which is the cause of injustice and suffering, whereas halacha really needs to be the thing that brings justice and comfort to the world. So I'll end with that here. Wow.
in order so that we can remain committed to our schedule for